Good morning, church. I pray that you had a great weekend. I can't believe the month of February is already over and we're now in the month of March. But as the weather gets warmer and our days get a little longer, I pray that we can continue to warm up our hearts to God and the calling and promises He has for you and I. With that, let's begin. In 2018, there was a very simple online multiplayer social deduction game called Among Us that was released to the world. But it wasn't until this pandemic and in the middle of the pandemic that it really started to get popular. The ideal of the whole game is this. You are assigned one of two different roles. You're either a crewmate or you're an imposter. Now, if you're a crewmate, you go around doing these different tasks and your role is to accomplish them. And then if you're an imposter, well, you act like you're doing these tasks and then you go around sabotaging people and then taking them out one by one until you get rid of all of them. As a crew member, one of the ways in which you win is that you have to expose or basically identify who the imposters are. And eventually, as a crewmate, that the imposters will in the end get exposed, right? Whether you win the game or lose the game, you will figure out who the imposter is at the end. But did you know there's actually a real life situation that happened? And it's very similar to the game Among Us. Now, the imposter that I'm talking about, he goes by the name of Frank William Abagnale Jr. Now, Abagnale was known as one of the most notorious imposters of our time. From the age of 15 all the way till the age of 21, he had a career of being a con man, a check forger, and he was really just a real-life imposter. And he took up different identities throughout his young career. Some of those things included being an airline pilot, a doctor, and even an attorney. Now, it's really a fascinating and bizarre story about Frank. And he would go to these extreme extents to hide his real identity and to maintain a fake one. It started off as a very small thing, right? His father gave him a truck and a credit card to pay for gasoline so that he could go to his part-time job. But instead, Frank wouldn't go and buy gas. He would go and purchase other car parts and things like that at a gas station, and then he would just go and return them and ask for cash. Eventually, he put his dad in $3,400 worth of debt. But if you translate that to our time now and in money, it's almost $70,000 worth of stuff. But from there, it started to get worse, right? He started to write fake checks and he started cashing them out, but he wanted them to look a little more legit. And so he would start impersonating these different identities. And he started off with being a fake airline pilot. And from that, he ended up flying more than 1 million miles, not as a pilot, but just, one of those pilots that sit on a plane and just kind of have to go from one place to another to maybe catch another flight. But he would go to all different places in the world and get free flights and get free hotels. And he literally tricked all these people thinking that he was a pilot, but in reality, he was just this kid. There was one instance where he almost got caught. And so he decided that it was time for a career change. So he decided to become a doctor in Georgia. Now, he was faking his time being a doctor. There was one instance where, there was a baby who was critically unwell because they were deprived of oxygen, but he didn't understand what they were trying to say, and so that's when he almost blew his cover there. But then from there, it just got worse, right? He made a fake Harvard University law transcript. He passed the Louisiana bar exam and basically got a job as an attorney for 8 months. And he almost lost his cover because one of his coworkers actually graduated from Harvard University, and he had a really hard time making up stories to a school that he didn't even go to. And eventually he, resigned, he left so that, to escape it, and he ran off to France, and eventually he was arrested. Now, all of the people that he met, I'm sure some of them had no idea who he really was. And some people really thought maybe he was a pilot or a doctor or an attorney. Some people held their suspicions, but man, what a real life imposter. Now, we continue through the book of 1 Timothy, and we continue to look at the instruction given by Paul to Timothy in light of church leadership. And here in chapter 5, Paul is talking about two groups of people within the church. He talks about widows, and he talks about elders. We find this here after all of that in 1 Timothy 5:24 and 25. It says, "The sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever." Now, Paul goes back and talks about this issues of sin, and specifically now he's referring to this issue he talked about earlier about the elders and some of the accusations that may come because of the things that elders do. And verse 24, he says basically there are two kinds of sin that we all carry. One, it's a sin that's quite obvious and easy to identify. And two, a sin that isn't so obvious but eventually will become known. Now, the first kind of sin that Paul talks about, really no explanation is needed. But the second kind of sin is kind of like the game Among Us or Frank Abagnale, right? They're just imposters. Paul warns us that these sins will trail behind them closely and kind of like a shadow. It's not too far behind, and soon it'll all be exposed. Now, Paul, in a very Paul-like fashion, he doesn't want to end here negatively. So he ends very positively. And he says, in the same way that there are two kinds of sins, there are two kinds of good deeds. One, good deeds that are obvious and easy to identify, and two, good deeds that are not so obvious but eventually will be known. Now, the point of Paul saying all of this, it's easy. Paul is talking to Timothy about eldership and these accusations, so it's easy for us to judge people based on the things that we see on the outside. But we have to remember that there are sins that people hide. So it's really hard to tell and decide who someone really is. In other words, what Paul is telling us is this: sometimes what we see on the outside isn't what's on the inside. So take it slow and wait on God for discernment instead. It's really good advice and a real reality that we have to deal with. So let's not be quick to judge. Let's be patient with when we deal with people that we may not know or people that we do know. And let's not assume one thing's about another. But not only that, what Paul is saying and telling us that in the end, the truth always prevails. The things that aren't so obvious will eventually come to light, whether they're good or bad. So with that, let's remember this. Instead of living lives as imposters, let's come out clean of our wrongs and live honest, truthful lives for God.